So you've got a website project. You know what it needs to look like and what it's supposed to do, but you're stuck on how to start. How do you even begin to begin? Luckily for you, today I'll show you exactly how to set yourself up for success in the real world as we get all of the essential prep work done on this social media dashboard. This is part 2 in a series on building a front-end mentor challenge, the social media dashboard with dark light toggle. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I recommend watching that first and then coming back here. In this video, we'll be setting up our workflow for HTML, Sass, and JavaScript files using Gulp to compile our Sass to CSS. Keep in mind that there's usually not just one right way to set up projects. I'm showing you one approach, but you can modify as needed for your own naming preferences and folder structures. The most important thing is to keep things organized so that future you or someone else can find everything easily. You can find all my source code for this project on my GitHub repository linked down below. All right, let's get into it. All right, so the first thing we want to do when we're creating our project files is to create our GitHub repo or repository. The reason we want to do this at the beginning is because there's a couple of reasons. One is that you have to create a new GitHub repository in an empty folder. So if you've already started creating your files and started coding, if you wanted to create a repo in the middle of that, you would have to create it in an empty folder and then manually move all your coding files to that folder. So it's just better and easier to create it at the beginning. The other reason to create the repo at the beginning, of course, is when we're using source control like Git, it's just a good idea to make commits to your repository as you're developing. So to kind of save your coding as you go along. So to create our repository, I'm going to use GitHub desktop app. I know a lot of devs like using the command line for Git because it's kind of faster and easier, but I personally like the desktop app and just the graphical user interface that you get with that. So in GitHub desktop, we're going to go to File and New Repository, and we'll give it a name of FEM for Front-End Mentor. And this is the social media dashboard dark light toggle. I know it's kind of a long name. We're not going to initialize it with the README, and I'll show you why in a little bit, but for now, let's just create this repository. And then we're going to go to VS Code, and we want to open that folder that we just created. So I have all my GitHub repos in a GitHub folder in the documents, and we'll open the folder. And right now there's nothing here except for this Git attributes file that Git just kind of generates. So now let's start moving the files that we need into our project folder. So if you remember last time in the previous video, we created the notes markdown file. So I'm just going to take this and I'm going to copy it into our folder here. So now we can see that the notes that we created last time is here for our reference. Now the other thing I want to do is I want to add the starter files that Front-End Mentor gives you. So this is the Front-End Mentor challenge page, and when you start the challenge, click here, visit Challenge Hub, and then it tells you can download these starter files. I am on the Pro account, so I have this option to download the design files, which we will be looking at in, I believe, a future video. For now, let's just download the starter files. You can click this download button to get them. I have actually already done that, so let me show you what that looks like. If we go to our download folder, we have the social media dashboard zip file, and I have already unzipped that to this folder here on my desktop. So if we check out the files here, we have a bunch of folders and different files, and I'm actually going to take all of these and copy them over to my project folder here. So let's take a look at what we have. So in VS Code, we're looking at our project now, and we have an index.html file from Front-End Mentor, and this just gives you the copy for the website, so you don't have to manually type everything out. So that's pretty helpful. The other thing they give you is a style guide markdown file, and this is helpful because it'll tell you the width of the design that you have for mobile and desktop. It also gives you the colors that are used in the design. So we're going to be using these when we create our Sass and CSS styles. So there's a lot of different variables for colors mostly. And then it tells you the font that we're using. This font is called Inter, and it's on Google Fonts, so we'll have to load that as well. So this is just helpful to be, a reference as you go along. The other thing that it gives you is images for the website. And then also there's a design folder. And this is if you don't have the pro account for Elementor and you just are kind of working from JPEGs. And I have done this in the past just with eyeballing and sort of estimating distances and sizes, and it works pretty well. So you can definitely get by using the free Elementor plan, but it is kind of nice to work from a design. And I did kind of want to show you the real world process when you're building a website from an actual design file. So I thought that would be cool to show all of you. Okay, so now that we have our starter files, I'm going to do a couple things to just configure things. So in this file, this is a gitignore file. This is from Elementor. So this will tell Git to ignore any files or changes to files that you don't want to commit to your repo. So this is so that you don't commit the actual design files to GitHub, because it's for the paid plan. This is for ignoring dsstore files, which I think is for a Mac thing. I always want to ignore the node modules folder and anything in that, because you install the npm packages from your package.json file to your node modules folder. So you don't really want to clutter your GitHub repo with the node modules folder, because anyone can install them from the package.json file. And I think that should be it for now. So we can just close these out. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is create the other files and folders that we're going to be using in our workflow. So this would be mainly Sass files. I'm using SCSS, syntax for Sass, and some JavaScript files. And then I'm going to set up the Gulp workflow. But let's set up our files for now. So in our root, we have the index.html file. And usually what I do is I'm going to create a folder called app. And this is where I'm going to store my working JavaScript and Sass files. So in the app folder, I'm going to create another subfolder called SCSS for the Sass. And then I'm also going to create another folder called JS. And I think, I just need to drag that so it's in the app folder. So here we have our JS and SCSS folders. So in the JS folder, let's create a file called script.js. And we'll add a little console log message saying hello. And this we'll use to test that our website is working and everything's getting loaded. Now in our Sass folder, we're going to create some more subfolders. There's going to be a lot of subfolders here, and this is just to keep things organized. This is one reason that I really like using Sass, because if we only use a CSS file, we would have a super long file just with all your styles there. Sass gives you a lot of different capabilities and power, really, in terms of organization and making things easier for you as you're writing styles. So we're going to be dividing out our styles into different folders as well as different Sass files. So in our SCSS folder, we'll create another subfolder, and I'm going to create a util. This is for utility styles. And in the util folder, let's create an index.scss file. And if you're not familiar with Sass, this might seem a little confusing or overwhelming. I will sort of show you everything that I'm doing in my workflow. So hopefully that will help. So I'm going to create another folder in the SCSS folder called globals. This is for global styles that I want to use. And in the globals, we're also going to create its own index.scss. Then we'll create one last subfolder called components. And again, this will have an index.scss file. And the reason we're doing things like this is because in this components folder, in each of these folders actually, we're going to create multiple other SCSS files. And the index.scss file will load all those other files. And then we will then load those files in our main SCSS file, which we need to create here. So style.scss. This will be the main file. So the way Sass works when you're working with partials, meaning when we split up the styles into these multiple files, is we can load them through our main style.scss file. So the way we're doing that here is we're using some, I guess, Sass functions, for lack of a better word. And what we want to do on our main Sass file, style.scss, is we want to load all the styles that we're going to create from components, globals, I think just components and globals. And I'll show you what we do with the util styles in a little bit. So to do that, we're going to use @use, and we're going to let's load the globals first. Globals, and then we'll add another use rule and add components. So this is all that we're going to add in our main Sass file because we're going to load all the globals and components with these rules here. Now let's start with the util folder. So let me close these other files out here. So this is the index Sass file in the utils folder. The utility styles that we're going to add here are mainly things like variables and functions and mixins, Sass mixins, that aren't actual CSS rules, but rather things that we're going to be using in the other Sass files in our project. So for example, in the util folder, let's start creating our Sass files here. So I'm going to create one called colors, and we'll load our color variables in there. Then we'll create another file called breakpoints, and this is going to be a mixin that I like to use in my projects for just a faster way to load your media queries. And we're also going to add another file called functions. And then I think I'll add one more file for our font styles. So fonts.scss. This is going to be for the font family, mainly that Google font that we saw in our style guide from Mentor. I am going to sort of cheat a little bit, and I'm going to copy the breakpoint styles that I've used in the past just to be a little bit quicker, but I am going to explain this and everything that we're doing here. So what happens is when you're usually writing a media query, you write it something like this. So media min-width, and then something like 50 EMs, and then you're going to write your styles in here. What we're going to do is we're going to use a mixin so that we can reuse the code every time we need to write a media query. So we don't have to type all this out, min width of 50 EMs. The other advantage of this, of course, is since we're using this mixin, if we want to ever change the 50 EMs to like 64 EMs, then we don't have to go and do a huge find and replace through all our styles. We can just change it in one place here in our breakpoints file. So this is why we're spending a little extra time setting this stuff all up. So what happens here is in the mixin will basically load reusable code that you want to use multiple times in your code base. So we create the mixin by saying @mixin, then we type in the name of the mixin we want to use, which is in this case the first one, breakpoint. And then breakpoint is going to have a parameter. So it's kind of like a function. And the parameter that's going to use is size. So then when we're loading this breakpoint mixin, it's going to load the code that we don't want to, keep typing out every time. So it's going to load the media query min width, and then instead of typing the number, we're using a map get. So this is a Sass map. It's kind of like an array or an object. And in this breakpoint mixin is getting the map called breakpoints up, and then it is putting the size variable in there. So what happens is it's going to load the breakpoints up map, and then whatever size you want to use in your mixin. So we have these saved here. So it's medium, large, extra large, and I've already set the widths in EM units here. And then the content is going to be whatever content you put in the mixin when you're actually using it in your styles. So just as an example, if we wanted to use this mixin breakpoint, we would, in our other styles, we would say include. Let me scoot this up here. So if we wanted to use this mixin in our code elsewhere, we would type in include breakpoint and then parentheses, and then we would choose the size that we wanted to set this media query at. So let's say we wanted to do large and up. So we'll say include breakpoint large, and then, whatever rule you want to add in here. So font size, 3 rems or something. And usually this mixin for Sass would be included inside, it would be nested inside the actual selector. So we would actually write it inside the selector. In this example, we're using H1. So this would load the breakpoint in the H1 tag, and the resulting CSS would look something like H1 and then font size 3 rems, and that would be in a media query. So media min width and the large width is 87.5 EMs. So it'd be something like this. This doesn't seem like a whole lot of maybe benefit from just writing this one time. Maybe it seems like it's almost the same amount of work, writing include breakpoint large as it would be to write out the media query. And that is kind of true. But again, if we ever wanted to change this 87.5 EMs, it would be kind of a hassle to have to go through, find every media query and update that. So it's just easier in the long run to use the mixin for that. And the other mixin that we have here is breakpoint down. And this is when you want to use the max width. So if we wanted to write some styles for medium width and small, but we don't want to do it for large. Usually I try to just stick with the min width media query, so this breakpoint up mixin, because usually the desktop styles have additional rules that mobile and tablet may not have, because the mobile design is usually a bit simpler than desktop design. For example, mobile designs, all the content's often stacked to one column, versus desktop, you have the content in multiple columns, so you need those extra rules for Flexbox or Grid to do that. So that's kind of a quick little crash course in how this works. So now that we've written the first util Sass rules, we want to include this breakpoints.scss file when we're importing it from the util folder. So to do that, we're going to go back to the index.scss file in the util folder, and we're going to import the breakpoints Sass file with forward breakpoints. And what this does is it doesn't do anything to the code, but it basically just takes all these styles that we wrote, and then when we use the util in our other styles, it's going to take all those styles there. So you can use it in any file that you need to. Okay, the next file we're going to work with is the functions file in the util folder. And again, I'm going to sort of cheat a little bit. I'm going to copy styles that I've used in the past. And this is the only thing that's going to be in this file. It's a function that will convert pixels to rems. You can see here I included the link here. It's from a CSS Tricks article. So to use this function, let's say in another Sass file we want to set the font size of an H1 to maybe like 30 pixels. So in the past, if you've seen my other videos, I would pull out my calculator and divide 30 by 16 to get to rems. And this is because 16 pixels equals 1 rems by default on most browsers, unless you change that in your settings. So we need to divide 30 by 16 to get rems, and we can use this function to do that. So we'll say rem 30, and we just use the number here. We're not using the unit. So if we save that, the resulting CSS is going to look like font size 30 pixels. Or I'm sorry, it's going to be whatever rems this is, which I guess we can pull out the calculator one last time here. 30 divided by 16 is 1.875. 1.875 rems. So this is the only purpose of this function, but it is kind of helpful just so I don't have to keep pulling out the calculator. I think there are other NPM packages or probably even VS Code extensions that will sort of do this for you automatically, but I just like doing this here so that I'm not dependent on having to install another tool. But you can do that if you want. So we'll just delete that since we don't really need it. Now let's start adding our colors. Actually, before that, let's make sure the functions gets forwarded into our util main one. So forward functions. Okay, so let's close these since we don't really need them. Now let's do the colors. And if you remember, we were just looking at the style guide here. And we're going to create variables in our colors Sass file for all the colors that they've given us. So I guess we can just do this one by one. I'm just going to copy each section here, and we'll edit out everything we don't need. And this is not correct syntax-wise for Sass, but we just want to have everything here. Okay, so that's all the colors. So let's start creating our variables. So when you're we're not going to use Sass variables because CSS has come out with CSS variables or CSS custom properties. And that's something that we kind of have to use because we're doing the dark light thing, and it doesn't work with Sass variables very well. This is because you can change the value of the CSS variable with JavaScript, without having to reload things. So, root, and usually we call it -- and I think I'm just gonna, say the colors. Lime green. Maybe we'll say lime green, one word. I think that's right. Is that right? Okay. Let's check here. CSS variables. I haven't worked with these a ton, so yeah. Okay. I was right. So -- name the color and then the value. I've just worked with Sass variables for so long that it just kind of sticks in my mind. Okay, that seems right. I'll add a semicolon. So we'll do bright red. And we're using HSL instead of the hex colors because HSL, which stands for hue, saturation, and lightness, so that's what each of these three parameters here are. It's a better way of changing the lightness or darkness of a color if you are using HSL. So I think it seems like people are just using HSL more nowadays than hex, so just trying to stay on top of stuff. Okay, so we'll do Facebook, Instagram. Oh, sorry, Twitter's first. Instagram. This is a linear gradient, so Instagram start. Not super creative with the naming here, but Instagram end, YouTube, and I think I'm actually just going to delete these as I go so we know where we've been. And then the toggle, there's a linear gradient, which my guess is, I have the design open here. So there's a toggle, and then there's the background gradient, which is what I am guessing this means. So there's a linear gradient, and then the toggle itself, which I'm guessing is the circle of the toggle. I guess we'll find out, but maybe I'll do toggle background start. And we'll just have to remember that this is going to be a linear gradient. And the cool thing about VS Code is that when you put a color in, it'll actually give you a little swatch of what the actual color is going to look like. So that helps. And then we'll just say toggle for this other one here. Okay. Now, this is where we get into the dark theme and then the light theme. And I think I need to go back to my notes to see how the theme works, just so that we can make sure we're setting things up right at the beginning. So I think this should work. Okay. Now this is the prefers color scheme thing. Okay, prefers color scheme dark. We would put the variables like here within this prefers color scheme media query. I think I want to find one for light dark mode toggle. I think what I can do is, what I'm guessing is going to happen is we'll make the light theme, I guess, the default. And then for the dark theme, if you set it to dark mode, then we would still need CSS variables for each color, but we would, set the background to this color when it's in dark mode. So I think we can still set all the colors in here, and then we will separate them out with the dark and the light modes later on with other styles and using that prefers color scheme media query. So we'll just go ahead and do this. And in terms of the naming is kind of the hardest part I've found. Maybe not the hardest, but naming takes a lot more time than you might think to name things in a way that makes sense and that you'll remember later, or that other developers will be able to understand if they take on a project that you're not working on anymore. So because these are going to be the dark mode, I might just say dark dash, and then these are actually named. So very dark blue is for the background, top background pattern, card background, text, and then other text. And then we have the same names with the light values on the second part. So I think I'm gonna say dark and then sort of use the same names here. So dark background. And then dark top background. Yeah, I think this should work. Then dark card back, or maybe just card, since there's only one card color given here. And then dark text 1, and then we'll say dark text 2 will be this. So we can always rename things later on if a different kind of name would make more sense. So we did the dark colors now. So I think what I can do is Control D to just duplicate that, and we'll rename things for the light mode. Oops. Oh, I include the toggle and I didn't want that. So just select the lines you need. Control D will duplicate those lines. Light. And then we will copy these. So the background light, top background, card background, and then text 1 and text 2. Okay, awesome. And we're done with these. So this is all the styles we need for our colors. So now that we're done with this, we just want to make sure that we are doing the same thing. So forward colors. And the last thing we want to make sure we have is the font styles. So if we go into our style guide, the fonts is this Enter font here. So let's get that font. And weight's 400 and 700. So in Google Fonts, let's scroll down to 400, select the style, and then we also want 700 bold. So we've selected those styles, and now we're going to just copy this stuff here. And we're going to go into our index.html file, and we want to load the fonts here. I don't know if I need to add this comment, but Google Fonts, just so we remember. Then we need to add the font family. And, you know, this might seem a little overkill, but I'm going to create a variable for the font. Font, enter. And we just need the value. And I didn't add it to the root element. There you go. So now let's say in the body we want to say font family, and we'll call that variable by saying var font enter. And that's kind of how you would use CSS variables. So we'll be adding those later on. Okay, so done with the fonts. So let's close that. Go into our index, make sure we're forwarding fonts. I think it was plural. Let's check. Yeah, fonts plural. Okay, so then let's just double check this. So in our util folder, we got our index file, which is open here. Breakpoints, colors, fonts are there, functions are there. Okay, perfect. So now we are done with the util styles. So we're done with our util styles. Okay, the next thing we're going to set up is our global style. So kind of in the same way that we did with util styles, we're gonna go into our global subfolder and we're gonna create some Sass styles. So in globals, I'm gonna say boilerplate. This is where I put a lot of default styles. And I'm going to create another one for typography. This is for styles for the text elements like the H tags and the anchor links and things like that. So I think it's just those two for right now. We might add more later, but for now, we'll stick with these two. Okay, so in our globals index Sass file, we're going to do the same thing that we did in our util and use the forward rule. So we'll say forward, and I'm just going to add them all even before I add these styles into our globals. So boilerplate, and then we'll say typography. Okay, that should be good there. So for the boilerplate styles, one thing I do is HTML, and I like to say font size 100%. This helps with accessibility. And I'm going to say box sizing, border box. And this ensures that if you add padding to an element, the total width is going to include the padding, not be in addition to the padding. So let's say we had like a div and we said width is 300, and then we set a padding of 20 pixels. If we have box sizing border box, the width plus the padding is still going to be just 300 pixels. If you don't do it, I think content box is the other option. Let's see here. Yeah, I think content box. So we want border box. If you don't use border box basically, and you set the width 300 and the padding all around to 20 pixels, the width would be 300 plus 20 pixels on the left, 20 pixels on the right, 40 pixels would be 340 pixels wide. Usually you want the width to be what you set it to, so it's better to include the padding in there. Now we want to inherit this box sizing property from all elements. So before, and then after. So box sizing inherit. And it's going to inherit that from the HTML element. Then for body, I usually like to do some resets. So I'll say margin 0, padding 0, and then we'll set the font family to that font that we just created. So font enter. And I think that should be good for our boilerplate styles. Okay, so we're done with that. And now we're going to add our typography styles. And we'll probably add some more stuff here, but for now, let's just start with the H tags. And I personally like to set the margin top to 0. Just because in your browser default, you'll have a margin on the top and the bottom. I like setting it to 0, and then we'll set the bottom margins, later on. And the other thing I want to do is for the anchor links, a visited, and I think a active, text decoration, none. So we don't have the underline. Yeah, all right. So that is good for typography. And let's just check one more time, make sure things are here, and that's good. And in our styles, we are using globals. Okay, you might be wondering why I haven't done a use for the util styles. The reason for that is in the utils, I'm using things like Sass mixins and functions and variables. And actually, I think I need to move all the CSS variables into the globals, because what happens is, for the util, something like the mixin is not going to on its own generate any CSS. So we only need to include it when we're actually using this mixin in whatever Sass files. Whereas for things like colors, we actually do want this to get forwarded in the main Sass file, because, we need to access these variables, and this is not a Sass thing. So any of the Sass things like functions, which aren't going to generate CSS, is what I like to keep in the util. So yeah, I'm just used to using Sass variables. So we just need to change things out a little bit. So I'm going to move the colors, because we're using CSS variables, and the fonts to the globals. So that should be right. And now we'll delete it from the util stuff. So yeah, things are always changing. So now we need to forward. I might actually put these on top. I don't know if it matters, but forward fonts and colors. Okay, so this should work, and we'll find out when we start setting up our Gulp workflow and compiling our Sass files. Okay, so we have our util and our globals set up. And the last thing we want to do is our components. So kind of in the same way we're going to create a lot of components as we build this thing. I'm just going to start with a couple that I think we're going to need. So in the components folder, we'll create a new file. And I'm just going to say, since we have those cards in the social media dashboard, I'll say card.scss. And then we'll just create another one called toggle.scss. This is mainly so that I can just add some test styles so you can see, what we need to do. So we'll just make some sort of fake-ish styles for element of class of card. We'll just say, I don't know, padding, rem. So we're gonna use that function that we created. Rem, let's say 20. So 20 pixels all around. And this is something that we can use to test when we're compiling our Sass. And if it doesn't cause an error and it outputs, you know, rem of whatever 20 pixels is, then we'll know it works. And for the other one, we'll also do toggle. And we'll say, we'll add some nested stuff. So maybe toggle button. And we'll say, we'll pretend this is the styles for that circle in the toggle. So border radius 50%. And maybe we'll add the color too. So color, we'll say width. And again, this is just like made up styles. So 16 pixels. We'll say this is the height of 16 pixels. Border radius of 50. And let's just say background, color. And we'll use our, what that color was, toggle. So it's just toggle. There we go. Okay, so we have toggle, we have card, and now we want to add in components. So I think we'll add forward card, forward toggle. All right, so these are the starter Sass files. We're obviously going to be adding a lot more stuff in our Sass files later on, but for now, let's just close all these out. And oh, actually one thing I forgot. So in our other Sass files, what we need to do in order to use this rem function here is we need to import the util styles. So what we usually do is at use, and then we need to get to the util, load utils from wherever we are here. So we're in the components folder, so we need to go one up and then go to util. And I think we just load it like that. And when you use, we have to give it a namespace. So I think by default, it will add a namespace of whatever the name is, but I kind of want to not have to say, you know, util dot whatever for all the styles that we wrote. So if you import it as a wildcard, then you can just use the names of, you know, the variables or the other thing that you created without having to use the namespace. So it's a little bit easier. But namespacing can come in handy if you're, you know, say importing styles from a library, or you just have so many styles that they kind of conflict. You might have something like a variable or a mixin that's called the same thing from the two different styles. So it's in that case, if you have that many styles that they're conflicting, then you can use a namespace to differentiate between which one you actually want to use. But in this case, since this is just, you know, a one-page sort of web app, we shouldn't have to use namespaces, but we can always add it later on. So we need to take this rule, and we also want to add it to our toggle styles because we're using the rem stuff here. I'm thinking about this variable here. So like, I'm wondering if we would also need to do a use of the globals. I'm not sure. So, you know, we'll see what happens, because I think the way the variables for CSS work is it's set on the root element. So since we're loading the global styles already in our main Sass file, it should be fine. It should be able to read that, but we'll see what happens when we compile everything. Now we are actually done with our Sass styles. It's going to exit out of everything here. And we already have our script file, we're good with that. And the last thing I want to create is a new folder called dist. And this is where we're going to put our compiled CSS and minified CSS and JavaScript files to load that in our index.html. So let me actually create a reference to both of those files that we don't have in existence right now, but we are going to generate them with our Gulp workflow. So let's see. Okay, this is in the head. So after the fonts, we'll load our styles. So link CSS, and this is coming from the dist folder, of course. So we're going to say /dist style.css, and then we'll load script source dist script.js. And I think I want to either set, I think I might want to set this to defer. Because in the past, you would have to load the script tag at the bottom of your body. But I think we can put it at the top and just set a defer to it. So let's look that up. So load JavaScript file, defer. Let's see what comes up. Flavio Copes. You can always depend on Flavio to have written a blog post about something that you're looking at. Okay, so when loading a script on an HTML page, you need to be careful not to harm the loading performance of the page. Okay, so yeah, script is traditionally included in the page this way. Okay, so this is bad to put the script in the head because there's a lot of delay introduced. So a very common solution to this is to put the script tag at the bottom of the page as for the closing body tag, which is what I usually do. So the best thing... Oh, I wonder if this is actually the best practice here. So you have to do that if you need to support older browsers that don't support these new features, async and defer. So these are the new things, async and defer. If you specify both, async takes precedence on modern browsers, while older browsers that support defer but not async will fall back to defer. So they only make sense when you're using the script in the head. Okay. So let's see. So no defer or no async. We don't want that. Async blocks parsing of the page while defer does not. Neither async nor defer guarantee anything on blocking rendering. Okay, and at the bottom, just tell me the best way. Best thing to do to speed up your page is to put them in the head and add a deferred attribute. Okay. Thank you, Flavio. There we go. Okay, so now that we're done with our Sass files and loading our JavaScript file, at least for now, we're going to set up our Gulp workflow. And we're using Gulp to compile our Sass to CSS. You know, as you can see, the Sass files are very different from when you're writing styles with CSS, with the functions, mixins, and also the nesting styles. So browsers can't read Sass files, so you have to use some kind of tool, a build tool, to compile or convert your Sass files to CSS. There are VS Code extensions that you can use. I used to use the Live Sass extension a lot. However, it doesn't support the new Sass use and forward rules. It only supports the old import rules, and those are getting deprecated by Sass sometime in the next couple years. So you kind of want to get used to writing the new syntax. And unfortunately, that extension, the Live Sass extension, has not been updated in, I think, 2 years. So, you know, you can find a different extension if you want to try the new syntax with Sass, or you can use this Gulp workflow. So we don't really need this file. So let's open our terminal window, and we're going to set up Gulp and install a bunch of NPM packages for our workflow. So the first thing you want to do when you're working with Gulp is you want to make sure you have the Gulp CLI installed. So if you don't have it, Gulp-CLI. I already have this installed, but if you don't have Gulp CLI installed, you can install it this way using the -G, and that will install it globally on your computer, so you can run Gulp CLI from any folder on your computer. So now we want to first create our package.json file. So I'm going to say npm. This is very long. It's kind of bugging me, actually. Let's just rename our folder here. Close folder. I'm just going to rename this to social dashboard, I think. Or maybe just dark light toggle, because that was kind of the main thing I was thinking about. Okay, so now it's dark light toggle. We want to create our package.json file, so npm install, npm init-i. So now we have our package.json file. We can now install a bunch of npm packages that we need. So npm install, and I am going to be using my Gulp config that I have from previous projects. So I will still walk you through how all that works. So we want to install a bunch of packages. So the first one is Babel core and Babel preset-env. And this is used for auto prefixer. There's some CSS properties that need to use browser prefixes like WebKit for browsers that don't support the sort of full thing. So for example, one property for that is transform. So transform is a property that is supported in modern browsers, but for older browsers, they may need to use the -WebKit prefix. So Babel will work with auto prefixer to determine, which properties get prefixed automatically. So that way you don't have to type it out yourself. So just another way that you can save time. So Babel, and then we're going to install Post CSS. This is a collection of plugins that auto prefixer is a part of. So you have to install both of them, I believe, to use auto prefixer. Then we're going to install browser sync. And this will, when we run Gulp, it's going to spin up a local server and it will sort of keep watching your files and reload the website anytime you make a change. So you don't have to manually reload in your browser. Then we're going to install CSS Nano for minifying our CSS. And we're going to install Dart-Sass because this is the version of Sass that supports this new syntax with the use and the forward and stuff like that. So we need to install that specifically if we want to use those new rules. Then we're going to install Gulp because we need Gulp Babel for the Babel stuff. Gulp Post CSS, Gulp Sass, that will do the Sass compiling, and then Gulp Cursor, which we're going to use to minify our JavaScript files. So we'll hit enter. Hopefully I didn't make any mistakes. And we should see all those npm packages added here in our package.json file. All right, no errors installing, which is great. So now in our package.json, we can see all the packages that we added in here. Now, one thing you might have noticed is found 3 vulnerabilities. So kind of a cool thing that npm does when you install is it'll actually tell you if the versions you've installed have any security vulnerabilities. So I don't know if this is the right way to do it, but I will just write npm audit fix if I can. Sometimes I'll type in npm audit just to see which packages they're talking about. So it looks like yargs parser, which is used in Gulp, and then glob parent, which is used in this Gulp thing too, and then another dependency of Gulp. So I usually will just type npm audit fix to see if this will work. But I think it may not because it says 3 vulnerabilities require manual review. Yeah, fix 0. So it's not great, but they're low and moderate, so I'm just gonna kind of leave it. They're not high security vulnerabilities, so I think it's kind of okay. I'm not super familiar with this part of npm and all the dependency securities, so feel free to flame me in the comments if this is a terrible thing to do. But yeah, if it's not like a high level, I'm just gonna leave it and keep going. Yeah, so now we have our dependencies installed. The next thing we want to do is start working with our Gulp workflow. So in our root, we're going to create a new file called gulpfile.js. And in here is where we're going to write all our configuration for Gulp. And again, I am going to cheat a little bit and use a previous Gulp file configuration and just copy and paste that here. But let me kind of walk you through what's going on here. So in a Gulp file, this is a JavaScript thing that you run on the command line using Node. And this is what we're going to use to compile and minify all our files. So at the top of your Gulp file, we are importing all of the npm packages that we just installed as modules into this file so that we can access them and any functions that they give us. That's what this top section is. Then if you scroll down a little bit, this is setting the Sass compiler to use Dart-Sass. And this is again so that we can use that new use and forward syntax in our Sass rules. So the next thing we need to do is we need to actually compile our Sass and JavaScript files. And that's what this next section here is. So we have a Sass task, and it's a function called SCSS task. And what this is doing is it's running, multiple different things, and they are using this pipe function, that's a Gulp function, to sort of run them one after the other. So what this is saying is this first line is taking the main Sass file, so app.scss.style.scss, and it is going to do stuff to this file. And in here, this option is setting source maps to true. Sass source maps are It's an extra file that's generated, and they're really cool because when you are testing your website in your browser and looking in the developer tools, when you inspect a certain set of styles, it will actually tell you the original Sass file and the line number where it came from, instead of, some location in your minified CSS file, which is kind of impossible to find. So source maps just makes things a lot easier when you're trying to debug and see where some style rule is coming from. So we're setting source maps to true, so it will create a source map. And then after that, we are piping the next thing we want to run, which is the Sass function. This is coming from the Gulp Sass module. So it's running Sass to compile the Sass to CSS. And then after that, we're going to run the post CSS plugins, Auto Prefixer and CSS Nano. So Auto Prefixer, as I mentioned before, it will add the browser prefixes to sort of support older browsers for those rules, for those CSS properties like transform that need the prefixes. And then CSS Nano will minify the CSS file. And then the last line here is it's going to set the destination of the final compiled CSS file into the folder called dist, which we created beforehand. You can see that right here. And then the option here is to set the location of your source maps file, which this dot means it's going to be set in the same location that we just indicated in the dist folder. So that's what we do for our Sass files. Now, if we go into JavaScript, we're doing a very similar thing. So we're taking the JavaScript file, which is app.js, setting source maps to true, which is a similar thing as our Sass source maps. Next thing we want to do is we want to run the file through Babel. And Babel is going to, make any modern JavaScript like ES6 compiled to an older version that older browsers can support, because not all browsers can read ES6. I think the only exception right now is IE11, which is losing support everywhere. So you don't have to include this, but I just like to do it in case you have those edge cases where a user might be using an old browser because, their company is still using Windows 7 for some strange reason because they don't want to pay the money to update to a newer version of Windows. So things like that where people may not be able to, use the most modern browsers. And the next line is using Cursor to minify our JavaScript file. And then the last line is similar to what we had with the Sass task, where it's setting the destination of the compiled file into our dist folder, and then also having the source map saved in the same location. So that's JavaScript task. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to add our browser sync functions. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, browser sync will spin up a local server and sync it to your files. And anytime you make a change, it's going to automatically reload your local website. So you don't have to manually hit, Control R every time you make a change. That's another way you can save time with build tools like this. So what this first function does is it spins up the browser sync server. So this is saying browser sync.init server, and we want to run the base directory of the server from the root location where the Gulp file is, which is here. And then the notify options here are just for the styles that you'll see in your terminal when you're running browser sync. And then it's using a callback function at the very bottom to indicate that it's finished running. Next function is a shorter function. It's a browser sync reload. So it's saying this will literally just reload the browser sync server that we spun up. And we want to combine this reload function with our watch task. So we're telling Gulp to actually watch these files. So for example, this first watch task function is going to watch our HTML files. And then if it detects any changes in them, it's going to run browser sync reload, which will reload the local website. And then the second part of our watch task is it's going to watch any Sass or JavaScript files. And if it detects any changes, it's going to rerun our Sass task and our JS task, and then also reload the browser. So those are all the functions that do stuff. At the very bottom of your Gulp file, we're going to export our default Gulp task. And the default Gulp task is what Gulp will run when you type in Gulp on the command line to start everything off. And so in our default Gulp task, we want to run all our tasks. So the Sass task, JS task, then we want to serve up the browser sync server, initialize it. And then we want to run our watch task. And the watch task is what will keep running when we are doing development, detect the changes, and then reload our website and rerun all of our other tasks. So I know that was kind of fast. I hope this makes sense. I am going to include a link to this whole project on my GitHub repo that I've created here. So I'm going to include a link to all that down below in the description so you can refer to it if needed. So now we have our Gulp file. Let's make our terminal a little bit bigger. So what we want to do is, we've already installed our packages. So I think all I have to do is just type in Gulp and see if things work. Okay, error in plugin Gulp Sass. It says Gulp Sass 5 does not have a default Sass compiler. Please set one yourself. That's weird. I thought I did set it in my Gulp file. Sass compiler. Gulp Sass 5 does not have a default Sass compiler. So what I do when I see errors like this is I literally will copy this and do a DuckDuckGo search for it. This next line says both the Sass and Node Sass packages are permitted, so I wonder if maybe that's the reason I don't need to say require. I'm not really sure. So let's just, anyway, copy this, go to Firefox, do a search in DuckDuckGo for this error message and see what happens. Okay, good old Stack Overflow. So this happened 8 days ago, so this is a very recent occurrence. Gulp Sass recently updated to version 5.0. They describe that it doesn't use a compiler anymore and you have to install it in separately. So they have documentation on how to let Gulp Sass require the compiler with this piece of code. Okay. So I did do similar syntax to this. Instead of require Sass, I wrote require Dart Sass. So I wonder if there's some issue with that. For now I rolled back to version 4. Okay. So what I'm wondering is, because I know that the Dart Sass version of Sass is the one that has a new syntax, I wonder if maybe that's included in the default stuff. Let's see. Okay. Oh, migrating your existing product to version 5. Read the migration guide. Okay. Let's do this so you can read, so I'm not blocking anything. Where were we? Migrating. Okay, Gulp Sass version requires Node 12 or later, includes some breaking changes. Additionally, changes in Node itself means that we should no longer use Node fibers to speed up asynchronous rendering with Dart Sass. So I want to see what they're saying about Dart Sass. npm install Sass, which I did. Var Sass require. Okay, so this is a new syntax. We used to recommend Node fibers as a way, but Node fibers are discontinued. So it's not saying that we have to. I mean, I guess we can just try this since this is the default thing that they said. Okay, Sass equals require Gulp Sass and then require Sass. So go up here, paste that in. I'm just going to comment this out for now. So I wonder if Dart Sass is now just a default Sass version. So what I could do is do another search for Dart Sass 5 Dart Sass and just see if anything comes up. Oh, here we go. Dart Sass is also distributed as the pure JavaScript Sass package on npm. All right, so I guess I don't have to explicitly say Dart Sass for the compiler. Okay, so now let's see if this works. We'll rerun Gulp. Uh-oh. Let's see what happened here. Module not found. Cannot find module Sass. Wait, did I not even install Sass itself? Oh, I installed Dart Sass, not Sass. Okay. I guess that was a mistake. So let's npm install Sass. Okay, so now I have Sass in our package JSON. Rerun Gulp. Oh, so okay, so this is our website, which is good. I did see an error, so let's take a look at that. But I'm glad this worked. Here we go. Deprecation warning using the slash for division is deprecated and will be removed in Dart Sass. Oh my gosh. So recommendation math.div, pixels, and then context. Oh, they actually fix it for you. Oh, that's pretty smart. So I guess for some reason the slash, I'm guessing maybe this has to do with the maybe Sass modules or something. I'm not really sure. So instead of division, you just go math.div and then say whatever. And instead of the division, it's just a comma. So let's go back into our code and change that. Wow, lots of new changes in Sass recently. This is in our function Sass file. So, okay, let's just make sure. So instead of this thing here, we're gonna say math.div. Okay. And then there's another error. There's no module with a namespace math. So I think I need to import that. It's like a separate Sass module thing. Let's look that up. So Sass math. I think we need to do an explicit like import. Okay, Sass math. So it's part of the built-in modules here. So let's look if they tell you the best way to do this. Okay, so here's an example. Use Sass color, and this is for the color module. And this is the math module. So I'm assuming use Sass math. So we'll have to add this at the top of this for use Sass math so that this math.div is accessible. Because before, since we didn't import the math module, it doesn't know what this math.div even is. So hopefully, I think that's the only other error that we saw. So now we've hopefully fixed this. We're going to have to do a Control-C to exit out of our Gulp task and rerun it. All right, no errors. Yay! So we loaded the website. So we just want to make sure that everything is loaded. So I'm going to go back to the right side. So I want to make sure that our console log messages, yep, hello. So that loaded, which is good. And then the second thing I want to check is going back into our code and opening up in our dist folder the script.js file. So that's there, that's good. And then our final CSS file. So let's take a look here. I'll do an Alt-Z to word wrap. So we can see our files here. We have our global files from the boilerplate, which is great. And then we have the card styles that I added and the toggle button. Hey, looks pretty good. Let's do another test in our index.html file. I'm just gonna use the h1 tag since I created some styles for that. Oops, h1, enter. And we'll just say social media dashboard. We'll just do this for now, just to test the styles. Okay, so we noticed that when we save the index.html file, it did reload. So let's check here. Ooh, here we go. Let's see if all those styles we wrote are added in here. So the margin top of 0, which is from the typography thing, and then it is getting the font family. Nice. And then you can see the styles added here. This is really good. So yeah, it looks like everything's working.
And that's how I'd set up a front-end website project using Sass and Gulp. If this video has been helpful, I would really appreciate it if you would hit the like button or leave a comment down below so that YouTube will show this video to more people. I know it sounds dumb, but that's how the algorithm works. So thank you for showing support. Part 3 should be dropping in a few weeks, but in the meanwhile, feel free to check out my other videos. If you noticed, I used a few shortcuts to make my coding faster, and you can learn all about them in my video on using Emmet shortcuts in VS Code. I promise it's worth your while. All right, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.